Chapter 1: Gold that floated quietly. Hey guys! Tonight, let's do something very simple. Dim the lights a little. Let your shoulders drop. If your phone is still glowing like a tiny artificial sun, feel free to flip it face down. You don't need it anymore. You're safe here. Nothing dramatic is going to happen. No battles. No twists. Just a long, slow drift down a river that has been doing the same thing for several thousand years and is frankly very good at it. Tonight we're talking about Nubian gold boats. Long wooden vessels, heavy with or moving almost silently down the Nile. No rush. No shouting. Just water, sun, and the quiet anxiety of ancient empires desperately hoping the shipment arrives intact. So get comfortable. Breathe slowly. And let's drift. Nubia sat south of Egypt, stretching along the Nile in what is now Sudan and southern Egypt. It was hot, and inconveniently rich in gold. This last part is what made everyone else suddenly very interested in Nubia's well-being, especially Egypt, which loved gold the way stressed people love tea. Constantly, ritualistically, and with the firm belief that things would fall apart without it. Gold wasn't just decoration. It was religion. It was politics. It was the physical proof that the gods still liked you. Temples glittered with it. Coffins were layered in it. Officials were buried with enough gold to make modern museum curators feel faint. And most of that gold came from Nubia. The Nile, of course, was the only sensible road. The desert around it was not inviting. So gold moved by boat. Long, narrow boats built to handle weight rather than speed. They weren't graceful. They weren't impressive. They were practical, which in ancient shipping terms meant slow, creaky, and constantly one bad decision away from disaster. These boats were loaded near the Nubian gold fields. The gold itself usually started as or not shiny treasure. Chunks of rock pulled from mines where workers labored in heat that made breathing feel optional. The ore was crushed, washed, sorted, and packed into sacks, jars, or wooden crates. All of it heavy. All of it valuable. All of it needing to arrive north without incident. The boats pushed off quietly. No ceremony. No dramatic horns. Just the sound of wood touching water. Oars dipped slowly. The Nile carried them north, because that's what the Nile does. It flows south to north, calmly ignoring the confusion this causes on maps. Sailing downstream was easier. You let the current do most of the work. The crews still had to steer, avoid rocks, sandbanks, and the occasional unhelpful hippopotamus, but the river was cooperative. It had been doing this job for millennia. It knew the route. The crews themselves were not nobles. They were experienced rivermen, people who knew the Nile's moods. When it rose, when it fell, where it narrowed, where it pretended to be calm and then absolutely wasn't. They worked quietly because shouting on a river doesn't help. It just makes the river annoyed. At night, the boats were tied up along the banks. Fires were small. Food was basic. Dried fish. Beer, because of course there was beer. Ancient Egypt ran on beer the way modern offices run on coffee. The gold sat nearby, watched carefully. Not because anyone planned to steal it, but because not watching gold felt like tempting fate. And fate did not need encouragement. The journey could take weeks. Sometimes longer. The Nile didn't care about schedules. If the wind shifted or the water dropped, you waited. Ancient logistics were mostly waiting. Waiting for water. Waiting for wind. Waiting for someone upstream to stop being a problem. As the boats moved north, the landscape slowly changed. The rocky Nubian stretches softened. More villages appeared. More fields. More signs that you were approaching Egypt proper, where everything became more organized and more bureaucratic. This is where the gold would stop being cargo and start being paperwork. By the time the boats reached major collection points, officials were ready. Scribal teams waited with pallets and scrolls. They recorded everything. How much gold? Where it came from? Who was responsible? Who would be blamed if something went missing? Scribal handwriting was calm, neat, and unforgiving. The gold was weighed. Carefully, slowly, repeatedly. Ancient scales were accurate enough to ruin someone's career. If the weight was off, questions were asked. If answers were unsatisfactory, consequences followed. Quiet consequences. Administrative consequences. The worst kind. From there, the gold was sent onward to workshops, temples, or royal treasuries. It became leaf, jewelry, statues, coffins, gifts for foreign rulers who needed reminding that Egypt was wealthy and doing just fine, thank you. What's remarkable is how little drama survives in the record about these shipments. No grand tales of pirate attacks. No heroic last stands. Mostly just notes, dates, weights, delivery confirmations. It's boring in the most comforting way possible. A system that worked well enough that nobody felt the need to write poetry about it. Of course, Egypt didn't just take gold from Nubia. Nubia was not passive in this relationship. Nubian kings ruled their own lands. Sometimes they ruled Egypt itself. The 25th dynasty was Nubian. Pharaohs from the south sat on the Egyptian throne, wearing crowns heavy with gold that probably came from their own homeland. History has a sense of humor like that. During these periods, the gold boats kept moving. They always did. Different flags. Different rulers. Same river. Same slow drift. Empires changed hands, but the Nile stayed employed. There's something deeply soothing about imagining this endless routine. Year after year. Century after century. Boats moving north. Gold moving with them. The world above constantly reinventing itself while the river just kept flowing. Even invasions didn't stop it for long. Foreign powers took Egypt. Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans. Everyone wanted the gold. And so everyone maintained the system. If you conquer a place with an efficient supply chain, you don't break it. You inherit it and pretend you invented it. Under the Romans, Nubian gold still flowed north. The paperwork got even heavier. Roman bureaucracy loved nothing more than counting things. Especially valuable things. Especially if they could tax them. The boats themselves changed slowly. Different construction techniques. Slightly different shapes. But the basics stayed the same. Long, sturdy, built for weight. Designed to move quietly through water that didn't care who was in charge this decade. The people on the boats probably didn't think about history. They thought about blisters, sunburn, whether tonight's beer would still be cold, whether the wind would cooperate tomorrow, whether the crocodiles looked particularly alert today. And then, eventually, the gold would be gone. Off the boat, counted, locked away. The boat would be lighter. The crew paid. And the journey would reverse, this time fighting the current back south with sails and patience. Upstream travel was harder, slower, more work. You waited for the north wind. You tacked. You stopped often. But there was less pressure. No gold aboard. No scribes waiting with frowns. Just the long trip home. This rhythm repeated until it felt eternal. Until climates shifted. Until trade routes changed. Until empires fell in ways that even the Nile couldn't ignore. But for a very long time it worked. And that's the strange comfort of Nubian gold boats. They weren't symbols. They weren't legends. They were infrastructure. Quiet, reliable, and mostly forgotten. Which is exactly the kind of history that makes good bedtime company. So as we move forward, deeper into the lives of the kings and officials who depended on these shipments, just remember this steady background. Boats drifting north. Gold resting in wooden hulls. Water moving gently beneath them. Chapter 2. Kings who needed the gold more than they admitted. By the time the gold boats reached Egypt's administrative centers, the people waiting for them were already stressed. Not visibly stressed. Ancient elites preferred a composed exterior, but internally very stressed. Because gold had a way of becoming urgently necessary right around the time it was least convenient. Egyptian kings liked to present themselves as timeless, eternal, perfectly balanced embodiments of cosmic order. But behind the scenes, they were constantly budgeting. Temples needed endowments. Priests needed paying. Soldiers expected rewards. Foreign allies wanted gifts. And nothing said, "Please don't invade us," quite like a generous amount of Nubian gold. Pharaohs didn't mind gold themselves, of course. That would involve effort. Instead, they issued orders. These orders traveled south. Supervisors were appointed. Overseers oversaw the overseers. Everyone wrote reports. Eventually, gold appeared. Or didn't. And that difference mattered a lot. When shipments were delayed, temples stalled. Building projects slowed. Priests grew anxious. And anxious priests were not ideal, because priests controlled the gods, at least on paper. If the gods became unhappy, it was usually blamed on the king, which was awkward. So kings paid attention to the river. Not directly. They had people for that. But the Nile's annual rhythms were tracked obsessively. Flood levels, navigation conditions, any disruption that might delay those quiet boats drifting north. Some kings were more dependent on gold than others. Periods of instability tended to increase demand. When your claim to the throne was shaky, you compensated with shinier objects. Extra large statues. Extra generous temple donations. The ancient equivalent of buying everyone drinks and hoping nobody noticed you didn't really belong there. Take the later New Kingdom, when Egypt's borders were stretched and expensive to maintain. Garrisons in Nubia. Campaigns in the Levant. Diplomacy that involved sending gold abroad at alarming rates. Letters from foreign rulers politely requesting more, because the last shipment was, frankly, a little underwhelming. These letters survive. They are wonderfully passive-aggressive. Complaints wrapped in compliments. Praise followed by pointed reminders. Gold was the language everyone understood, and Nubian gold was the most fluent dialect. Meanwhile, Nubian elites were not oblivious. They knew their land's value. They negotiated. They resisted when possible. Sometimes they complied because it was easier. Sometimes because resistance brought consequences. The relationship was long, complicated, and rarely equal. There were Nubian rulers who leveraged gold to strengthen their own power. Controlling mines meant controlling influence. And when Nubian kings eventually ruled Egypt, they did so with full awareness of how much Egypt relied on their homeland's resources. It was a quiet reversal. No speeches. Just control of supply. These Nubian pharaohs presented themselves as restorers of tradition. Pious. Conservative. Almost aggressively respectful of old customs. Which was smart. If you're a foreign dynasty ruling Egypt, you don't advertise it. You become more Egyptian than the Egyptians. Gold helped with that. Lavish temple restorations. Donations that made priests very comfortable. Statues that gleamed reassuringly. If the gods were pleased, nobody asked awkward questions about ancestry. Of course, the system only worked if the boats kept moving. And most of the time they did. But occasionally, something went wrong. Low water. Conflict. Administrative failure. A corrupt official skimming a little too much off the top. These moments ripple faintly through the records. A missing shipment didn't cause panic immediately, but delays piled up. One postponed temple renovation turned into several. A promised payment to soldiers arrived late. Morale dipped. Grumbling began. And grumbling in an ancient army was never a great sign. So kings wrote more orders. Sent more inspectors. Threatened punishments. Not dramatic punishments. Administrative ones. Demotion. Confiscation. The slow death of reputation. In elite circles, that hurt more than anything physical. Meanwhile, the boats themselves remained indifferent. They floated. They docked. They waited. The river did not care who was anxious upstream. As Egypt moved into later periods, under Persian and then Greek rule, the gold trade continued with minimal interruption. New rulers quickly learned the value of existing systems. The Persians taxed it. The Ptolemies monopolized it. Everyone wanted their share. The Ptolemies, in particular, loved gold. They loved spectacle. Pageantry. Over-the-top displays of wealth that bordered on the absurd. They needed Nubian gold to fuel this aesthetic. Without it, Alexandria would have been significantly less impressive, and the Ptolemies were not interested in that outcome. They reorganized mining operations, tightened control, increased output, at least on paper. The human cost was significant, but rarely discussed in elite narratives. The boats continued to drift north, quietly carrying the weight of that labor. Roman administration was even more meticulous. Detailed records, clear chains of responsibility. Gold became part of imperial accounting. Just another resource to be extracted and shipped. Efficient, unsentimental, and still the Nile carried it, year after year, quietly connecting distant places, making kings look powerful, making empires function. The irony is that most of the people who depended on Nubian gold never saw the boats. They saw the results, the finished objects, the glittering surfaces. They didn't see the slow drift, the patient steering, the long nights tied to the riverbank. But that slow movement mattered more than any coronation ceremony. Without it, temples dimmed, courts shrank, armies complained. The illusion of eternal stability cracked just a little. And so, while kings posed as divine, they were deeply reliant on logistics, on river crews, on miners, on scribes, on boats that didn't leak too badly. It's not the most glamorous foundation for divinity, but it worked. As dynasties rose and fell, the gold boats remained the quiet constant. They didn't care who ruled. They didn't care about titles. They carried weight. They followed the current. They arrived when they arrived. In the next stretch of our drift, we'll follow the gold into the lives of the people who touched it last before it disappeared into treasuries and tombs. The officials, the priests, the ones who measured, recorded, and quietly worried. Chapter 3. The men who counted it all very slowly. By the time Nubian gold reached its final destination, it was no longer dramatic. It had lost whatever romance it might have briefly possessed while drifting on the river. Now it was an administrative problem. And administrative problems belong to a very specific class of people. Literate, slightly tired, deeply invested in making sure the numbers lined up so nobody yelled at them later. These were the scribes. Scribes were everywhere in Egypt, but gold scribes were a special breed. They dealt with weights that mattered. Not symbolic weights. Real ones. The kind that, if recorded incorrectly, could lead to uncomfortable conversations with supervisors who did not enjoy being embarrassed in front of their own supervisors. When the boats arrived, the unloading process was unhurried. There was no rush. Rushing caused mistakes, and mistakes caused audits. Gold was carried off in measured portions. Not dumped, not tossed. Carefully transferred, one container at a time. Each container was weighed. The scale was checked, then checked again. The scribe noted the weight, paused, and then noted it again somewhere else. Red ink for headings. Black ink for details. This wasn't decoration. It was a system designed to keep things boring and accurate. The scribes worked sitting down. Always sitting down. Standing scribes were either messengers or amateurs. Serious record-keeping happened from a seated position, legs folded, writing board balanced, just so. Comfort mattered when you were going to be doing this for hours. The language they used was precise, completely unpoetic. There were no flourishes, no metaphors. Gold was described in terms of weight and origin. Which mine? Which shipment? Which official signed off at each stage? It was the ancient equivalent of a spreadsheet, minus the frustration of software updates. If the numbers matched previous expectations, everyone relaxed slightly. If they didn't, nobody panicked immediately. Panic was inefficient. Instead, they reweighed, then re-reweighed, then consulted earlier records. Someone would quietly clear their throat. Most discrepancies were small. Natural loss, measurement variation, acceptable margins. These were noted, explained, and filed. But occasionally, something was wrong enough to require attention. Not shouting attention, just more writing. An investigation would begin. Quietly, a chain of responsibility would be traced backward. Who sealed the container? Who transported it? Who supervised that person? This could take weeks, months. Ancient bureaucracy did not move quickly, but it moved relentlessly. The scribes themselves were not wealthy. They handled enormous value daily, but owned little of it. Their power came from access and literacy. They knew where the gold was supposed to be. They knew where it actually was. And they knew how to phrase discrepancies in a way that protected themselves. Most scribes lived cautiously. Modest homes. Reliable routines. They ate well enough. They slept well enough. They avoided scandal. Because scandal attracted attention, and attention attracted reassignment, and reassignment might land you somewhere hot and unpleasant. They believed in order, or at least behaved as if they did. Order kept the universe functioning, or at minimum, kept pay coming. Some scribes worked for temples, others for royal treasuries. Temple gold was theoretically sacred, belonged to the gods, which meant humans were trusted to manage it on the gods' behalf, an arrangement that worked about as well as you'd expect. Temple treasurers kept careful inventories. Offerings came in, gold went out, repairs, ritual objects, payments to priests, everything documented, everything justified. The gods, according to temple accounting, were extremely detail-oriented. Royal treasuries were similar, but more tense. Kings changed. Officials rotated. Favor shifted. A scribe who survived one reign might not survive the next, professionally speaking. Continuity depended on being unobtrusive. Gold destined for burial was handled with particular care. Once assigned to a tomb, it was effectively gone from circulation. Dead kings were not known for returning assets. These allocations were approved at the highest levels, and scribes recorded them with an air of finality. What's interesting is how rarely scribes comment on the absurdity of it all. Gold hauled hundreds of miles, weighed endlessly, buried permanently, all to accompany someone who no longer needed it. But commentary was not their role. Their role was to write it down. The physical spaces where this happened were quiet. Storehouses, offices, temple rooms with thick walls and minimal decoration. Cool compared to outside. Dim but functional. The soundscape was minimal. Reed pens scratching. Occasional murmurs. The soft clink of metal. This quiet was intentional. Gold demanded focus. Noise distracted. Distraction led to errors. Errors led to consequences. And so, while kings made speeches and priests performed rituals, the actual movement of wealth happened here. Slowly, calmly, repetitively. The Nile delivered the gold, but scribes decided its fate. Over time, some scribes advanced. Senior positions. More responsibility. Slightly better living conditions. But even at the top, the lifestyle remained restrained. Ostentation was dangerous. It raised questions. Questions invited scrutiny. Corruption existed, of course. It always does. But it was limited by the system's redundancy. Too many eyes. Too many records. Too many copies of the same information stored in different places. Stealing gold required coordination and silence was hard in a culture that loved writing things down. When foreign powers took over Egypt, they relied heavily on these same scribes. Literacy was portable. Systems were transferable. A new ruler might issue new orders, but the old records were still consulted. Continuity mattered more than ideology. Under the Ptolemies, Greek officials supervised Egyptian scribes. The scribes adapted. New languages. Same methods. Record. Verify. The gold didn't care what language described it. Romans trusted the system almost immediately. They added layers. More reports. More oversight. But the core remained unchanged. Nubian gold arrived. Egyptian scribes counted it. Rome benefited. For the scribes, daily life continued. Writing, counting, sitting, eating lunch, writing some more, going home, sleeping, returning the next day to do it again. It was not glamorous, but it was stable. And in ancient times, stability was luxury. The irony is that these quiet individuals ensured the functioning of empires far larger than themselves. Without their careful attention, kings would have had nothing to display. Temples would have lacked offerings. Armies would have gone unpaid. But history rarely remembers them by name. Their handwriting survives. Their calculations survive. Their existence is implied rather than celebrated, which is probably how they preferred it. As night settles in our story, imagine one of these scribes finishing a long day, stretching stiff legs, closing a scroll, sealing a record room. Outside, the Nile continues to flow. Somewhere upriver, another boat is already on its way. Chapter 4. When gold became a personality. Once gold left the hands of scribes, it stopped being quiet. Not literally loud, of course. Gold doesn't make much noise unless you drop it, which everyone carefully avoided. But symbolically, it became very chatty. It started saying things about power, devotion, legitimacy, and personal taste. Mostly personal taste, and not always good. This was the stage where elites finally interacted with Nubian gold in a way that felt meaningful to them. Not as numbers, not as weights, but as objects they could point to and say, yes, this proves something important about me. Temples were usually first in line. Gold was applied to statues with careful reverence. Thin sheets hammered patiently until they were almost impossibly light. Gold leaf was not flashy in motion. It didn't sparkle dramatically. It glowed. Softly. Steadily. The kind of glow meant to reassure people that the gods were present and still accepting donations. Priests oversaw this process with solemn attention. They spoke softly. They followed ritual steps. They made sure nothing felt rushed. Because if a statue cracked or a layer peeled, it wasn't just a workmanship issue. It was a cosmic one. You don't want to be the priest who messed up the god's face. Once finished, these statues sat in dim sanctuaries. Flickering lamplight caught the gold and made it seem alive. This was intentional. Gods weren't supposed to look static. They were supposed to feel present. Watching. Mildly judgmental. Visitors didn't see the ledgers. They didn't see the boats. They saw the result. Gold where it mattered. Gold where it reinforced belief. And belief, conveniently, reinforced the authority of the people who controlled access to it. Royal use of gold was more personal. Kings wore it. Literally. Crowns. Collars. Bracelets. Rings. Heavy ones. Some kings liked restraint. Others did not. There was a spectrum, and a few of them lived very confidently at the excessive end. Gold jewelry was not subtle. It announced rank instantly. It reflected sunlight aggressively. It said, without words, that this person had resources, that they were worth protecting, or obeying, or at least not ignoring. Court life revolved around this display. Ceremonies were choreographed so gold caught the light at the right moments. Processions moved slowly to allow maximum visual impact. If you're going to wear this much metal, you might as well give it time to be appreciated. Foreign envoys noticed. They were supposed to. That was the point. Gold was diplomacy that didn't require translation. A well-timed gift could smooth negotiations, distract from military weakness, or encourage favorable reporting back home. These gifts were carefully chosen. Not just raw gold. Finished objects. Cups. Jewelry. Decorated items that showed craftsmanship as well as wealth. Nubian gold, transformed into something unmistakably Egyptian, traveled far beyond the Nile. And then there were the tombs. Tombs absorbed gold like nothing else. They were designed to. A king's burial was the final, ultimate display. Gold here wasn't for the living. It was for eternity. Or at least that was the idea. Coffins were layered. Wood, plaster, gold. Masks were shaped to idealized faces. Perfect. Free from the concerns that defined actual life. The gold didn't reflect reality. It replaced it. Inside tombs, gold objects surrounded the body. Jewelry, amulets, furniture fittings, all intended to serve the deceased in the afterlife. The afterlife, according to elite planning documents, was extremely well appointed. This practice required enormous quantities of gold, and it removed that gold permanently from circulation, which meant more boats, more mining, more shipments. Death, it turns out, was a major driver of the ancient economy. Not every royal burial went as planned. Tombs were robbed, sometimes almost immediately, sometimes centuries later. Gold has a way of tempting people across time. But even that risk didn't stop the practice. Kings still wanted to be buried well, because not doing so felt worse than the possibility of theft. Queens also used gold, though often in different ways. Jewelry emphasized elegance rather than sheer weight, at least officially. Some queens absolutely wore heavy pieces. Power didn't disappear just because it was paired with refinement. Royal women used gold strategically. Gifts to temples. Donations in their own names. Objects inscribed with titles. quiet reminders of influence. Gold was one of the few ways women could visibly assert authority without causing immediate discomfort among male officials. Children of the royal family wore gold too. Smaller pieces, scaled-down versions of adult symbols. From an early age, status was reinforced physically. You grew up feeling its weight. Literally, by the time you were an adult, it felt normal, which is perhaps why some rulers lost perspective. When you are surrounded by gold from childhood, it stops feeling exceptional. It becomes background, something you expect, something you assume will always be there. This is where problems began. Kings who overspent, who promised more gold than was available, who underestimated the effort required to extract and transport it. Their reigns are marked by frantic temple donations and sudden shortages. Priests noticed. They always did. A reduction in offerings was alarming. Gods might notice too, or at least priests would say they did. Pressure flowed upward. Officials were sent south to push production harder. Mines expanded. Labor demands increased. The boats carried heavier loads. The system strained, but didn't immediately break. It rarely does. It just becomes less comfortable. Under foreign rule, gold symbolism shifted slightly. Persian kings used Egyptian gold to legitimize themselves locally while sending much of it east. Greek rulers used it to fund wars and spectacles. Romans melted it down and redistributed it across an empire that barely noticed where it came from. But even then, the symbolism persisted locally. Temples still gleamed. Statues still shone. The gold still said, "This place matters." Even if the power behind it had changed. One of the strangest aspects of all this is how carefully gold was controlled in life, only to be abandoned in death. Tombs were sealed, gold locked away, and then forgotten, at least intentionally. This wasn't ignorance. People knew tombs could be robbed. They knew wealth could be lost. But burial practices were about belief, not practicality. If the afterlife required gold, then gold was provided. Future consequences were someone else's problem. This mindset extended to other elites as well. High officials were buried with gold. Not as much as kings, but enough to be noticed. Enough to mark their status even after death. Enough to require more shipments, more boats, more slow journeys north. So gold became cyclical. Displayed. Buried. Mined again by tomb robbers. Melted. Redistributed, possibly shipped again. The same metal might serve multiple lives across centuries. And through it all, the river continued, carrying new shipments, carrying old traditions, carrying the quiet labor that made all this possible. Gold, once symbolic, became emotional. It comforted the living. It reassured the anxious. It promised continuity, even when continuity was very much in question. As we move further along, we'll begin to see what happens when that promise starts to feel hollow. When the gold still arrives, but the world around it is changing faster than anyone is comfortable admitting. For now, though, let the image soften. Gold catching lamplight in a temple. A statue gazing forward without blinking. Somewhere far south, another boat easing into the current, carrying the raw material for someone else's sense of permanence. Chapter 5. The people who never got to wear it. By the time Nubian gold reached temples, palaces, or tombs, it had already passed through many hands. Most of those hands never touched finished gold. They touched rock. And occasionally regret. These were the people at the beginning of the process, whose lives were shaped by gold they would never see polished. The gold mines of Nubia were not pleasant places. Nobody ever described them as such. Ancient sources are quiet about details, which usually means the details were bad enough that elites preferred not to dwell on them. Mining took place in arid regions, far from the river, where the land was dry, rocky, and deeply uninterested in human comfort. Workers lived in temporary settlements. Low structures, little shade, limited water. Supplies arrived irregularly. When they arrived at all, the sun was relentless. The nights were not always cooler. This was not a career you chose for personal fulfillment. Some miners were paid laborers. Many were not. Prisoners, conscripts, People assign because someone else needed the gold more than they needed your long-term health. This arrangement was considered efficient. It was also brutal in a very quiet, administrative way. Mining itself was simple and exhausting. Rock was broken with stone tools or metal implements. Fire setting was sometimes used, heating rock and then cooling it rapidly to crack it. This filled confined spaces with smoke. Breathing was difficult. Visibility was worse. Nobody wrote poems about it. Once ore was extracted, it had to be processed. Washed. This usually happened near the mines. Workers stood for hours grinding rock into smaller pieces, then washing it to separate heavier gold particles. This required water, which had to be hauled in. Slowly, repeatedly. The gold that resulted was not impressive yet. Grainy. Mixed with debris. It took experience to recognize what mattered. Supervisors watched carefully. Gold dust was easy to lose. Easy to pocket. And pocketing gold was a risk that some people decided was worth taking. Punishments for theft existed. They were not gentle, but enforcement varied. Some supervisors were strict. Others were flexible if their own numbers stayed acceptable. Corruption was part of the system, even if the system pretended otherwise. Once enough gold was collected, it was packaged for transport. This was the moment it officially entered the river economy. From here, it would move north, away from the people who had extracted it, toward people who would never think about them again. For the miners, there was no sense of continuity. Gold left. New demands arrived. More extraction. More labor. The cycle repeated until bodies failed or assignments changed. Few miners lived long lives. Fewer still left records. And yet, without them, nothing else happened. No boats. No scribes. No temples. No gleaming statues. The entire illusion of wealth rested on people who were largely invisible in historical narratives. This invisibility extended beyond mining. Boat crews weren't elites either. Their work was less physically destructive, but still demanding. Long hours. Exposure. Responsibility without recognition. If a shipment arrived safely, it was expected. If it didn't, questions followed. River crews learned early not to draw attention. A successful journey meant you blended back into routine. You didn't boast. You didn't celebrate publicly. You tied up the boat, reported in, and waited for the next assignment. Some crew members made the journey for years, decades. They knew the river intimately. Its bends, its moods, where it widened, where it narrowed. They could read water the way scribes read text. But their knowledge wasn't written down. It passed orally, from older sailors to younger ones. If someone fell ill or died during a journey, the boat kept moving. Stops were made when possible. Bodies were handled according to circumstance. There was no drama, no ceremony, just practicality. The gold could not wait. At the administrative level, there were middle managers, overseers who coordinated shipments, balanced expectations from above with realities on the ground. These people lived in constant tension. Too lenient and output fell. Too strict and workers disappeared, resisted, or collapsed. They wrote reports carefully, chose words deliberately, blamed circumstances when necessary, praised subordinates selectively. Their survival depended on being competent but not noticeable. Some of these overseers came from Nubian families. Others were Egyptian. Loyalties were complicated. Identities overlapped. The system blurred distinctions when it needed to. Gold didn't care where you were from, as long as you delivered. Women also played roles, though they appear less often in records. In mining settlements, women processed or prepared food, carried water, maintained daily life. Their labor was essential and constant. Their names are almost entirely lost. Children grew up around these operations. They learned routines early. Grinding, caring, watching. Gold shaped their world, even if they never saw it shine. For them, it was just another demanding presence in daily life. What's striking is how normalized this was. There's no evidence of widespread outrage in elite texts. Suffering was not hidden, but it wasn't problematized either. It was simply part of how wealth was made. From the perspective of kings and priests, this distance was convenient. Gold arrived without visible cost. Boats drifted north. Records were clean. Temples gleamed. The human expense stayed far away. Occasionally, disruptions forced acknowledgement. Labor shortages. Rebellions. Desertions. When output dropped sharply, investigations followed. Not into conditions, but into efficiency. The question was never, are we asking too much? It was, how do we get back to previous levels? This attitude persisted across dynasties. Native Egyptian, Nubian, Persian, Roman, different languages. Same assumptions. Gold was essential. Labor was replaceable. And yet, the system's endurance depended on a kind of unspoken understanding. Push too hard and it broke. Not immediately, but gradually. Fewer workers, lower quality, more losses. The river couldn't fix everything. By the late periods, some gold sources were exhausted. Others became harder to access. Costs rose. Returns diminished. The boats still moved, but sometimes with lighter loads. This wasn't announced publicly. It was managed quietly. Temple donations became more symbolic. Royal displays shifted. The illusion adjusted. Gold was still present, but its abundance was no longer guaranteed. For the people at the bottom, this didn't bring relief. It brought uncertainty. Fewer shipments meant fewer jobs, or more pressure to extract from what remained. Decline rarely improves conditions for laborers. As empires expanded elsewhere, attention drifted. Nubian gold mattered, but it wasn't the only resource anymore. Trade networks widened. New supplies entered circulation. The Nile remained important, but no longer singular. Still, for centuries, the rhythm held. Transport, record, display, buried, repeat. The quiet tragedy is that this rhythm depended on people whose lives were defined by exhaustion and anonymity. Their contribution was enormous. Their recognition minimal. History remembers the gold. It remembers the kings. It remembers the temples. It rarely remembers the people who made all of that possible. As we continue drifting forward, we'll start to see what happens when this system, so carefully maintained, begins to fade. When boats still move, but the world around them is shifting in ways no amount of gold can fully stabilize. For now, let the pace slow again. Imagine the desert at dusk. Workers finishing a long day, or piled nearby. Somewhere far north, gold already shaped into something meaningful to someone else. And between them, the river, waiting patiently to carry the next load. Chapter 6, when the river kept flowing but the world didn't quite match. The Nile did not notice decline at first. Rivers are famously bad at noticing human problems. It rose when it rose. It fell when it fell. It carried boats whether they were full of gold or mostly empty and hoping nobody asked too many questions. But people noticed. By the later periods of Egyptian history, especially under foreign rule, something subtle shifted. Not a collapse. Not a dramatic ending. Just a gradual thinning. Fewer shipments. Smaller consignments. Longer gaps between arrivals. Nothing alarming enough to announce, but enough to make administrators uncomfortable. Gold still came from Nubia. It just didn't feel endless anymore. Some mines were exhausted. Others required more effort for less return. The easy gold had been taken generations earlier. What remained was deeper, harder to reach, and more expensive in terms of labor. This was not ideal, but it was dealt with the usual way. By pushing harder. More workers were conscripted. More time was demanded. Supervisors wrote increasingly optimistic reports. Production targets were revised in ways that sounded reasonable on paper and were very unpleasant in practice. The boats still drifted north, but their loads told a quieter story. Scribal records show adjustments. New accounting language. Phrases that suggested normalization rather than celebration. Gold was still important, but expectations were being managed. Temples adapted first. They always did. Offerings became more symbolic. Repairs were postponed. Some statues were re-gilded instead of newly covered. This was framed as tradition rather than necessity. Restoration, not reduction. Priests spoke confidently. The gods, after all, were eternal. They didn't need constant upgrades. This was reassuring language for a population that noticed changes but didn't want to dwell on them. Royal displays also shifted. Less emphasis on sheer quantity, more on craftsmanship. A smaller object, exquisitely made, could still signal power if framed correctly. This was the ancient equivalent of saying quality over quantity and hoping everyone nodded. Foreign rulers were pragmatic. The Romans, in particular, did not romanticize Egyptian gold. They valued it, certainly, but they were managing an empire with many sources of wealth. Nubian gold was useful, not sacred. Under Roman administration, some mines were reorganized. Others were abandoned when they no longer justified the effort. This wasn't emotional. It was logistical. If gold cost more to extract than it was worth, attention shifted elsewhere. For the local populations, this brought instability. Mining settlements emptied. Workers were reassigned or dismissed. Boat crews found fewer opportunities. A system that had provided harsh but consistent employment became less predictable. This unpredictability was more unsettling than the labor itself. People had built lives around the rhythm of extraction and transport. When that rhythm faltered, there was nothing obvious to replace it. Meanwhile, Egypt's symbolic relationship with gold remained deeply ingrained. Kings still associated it with legitimacy. Priests still linked it to divine favor. But the gap between symbolism and supply widened. This gap produced anxiety. Not overt panic. Quiet concern. Officials double-checked inventories. Treasurers became more cautious. Donations were planned carefully. The days of casual abundance were over. The Nile, however, continued to look the same. Boats moved. Sails caught the wind. Water reflected the sky. To an outsider, nothing seemed different. That was part of the problem. Decline without visible markers is hard to respond to. Nubia itself changed as well. Local power structures shifted. New groups emerged. Old alliances weakened. Control over gold sources became more contested. Egypt was no longer the uncontested center of the region. This didn't stop the trade entirely. It complicated it. Negotiations replaced commands. Tribute replaced extraction. Gold still flowed, but under different terms. These negotiations rarely appear in dramatic narratives. They survive as fragments, mentions in texts, slight changes in titulature. A foreign king described as a partner rather than a subordinate. Language softened because reality required it. For the people on the boats, this meant uncertainty. Who was in charge now? Which official to report to? Whose seal mattered? Bureaucracy thrives on clarity, and clarity was in short supply. Some boat crews adapted by carrying different goods. Stone, grain, other metals. The Nile was versatile. Gold had been important, but it was never the only thing it carried. Trade adjusted as best it could. In temples, gold objects aged. Tarnish appeared. Repairs were delayed. This didn't diminish their symbolic power entirely, but it changed the atmosphere. The glow was softer, less insistent, more nostalgic. Priests adjusted their rhetoric. Emphasis shifted toward piety rather than prosperity. The gods favored devotion, not display. This was not a sudden theological revelation. It was a practical one. Royal tombs from later periods reflect this shift. Still careful, still meaningful, but less extravagant. Fewer layers, thinner leaf. The afterlife, it seemed, would have to make do. This was not seen as failure. It was framed as restraint. Moral narratives emerged around simplicity and tradition. The past was idealized. The present was managed. And yet, the memory of abundance lingered. Stories of earlier kings. Grand temples. Mountains of gold. These stories circulated quietly, becoming part of cultural identity. A reminder of what had been. The river carried those memories too. Every bend had seen better days, depending on who you asked. The Nile had transported glory and decline with equal indifference. What's remarkable is how long the system endured, even in reduced form. Centuries of adaptation, adjustment, quiet compromise. Gold never disappeared entirely. It just stopped being limitless. For the people who had lived under its shadow, this required a mental shift. Wealth was no longer assumed. It had to be justified, explained, allocated with care. This didn't make life easier. It made it more cautious. As Egypt moved further into the Roman period and beyond, Nubian gold became one resource among many. Important, but no longer defining. The Nile remained central, but its cargo diversified. And still, boats drifted. Slowly, calmly, carrying whatever the era required. In the next chapter, we'll linger on what remains when systems like this fade. Not ruins, exactly. Not endings. But habits. Memories. Quiet traces in records and landscapes. Chapter 7. What lingered after the boats were no longer special. Long after Nubian gold stopped feeling infinite, the habits it created refused to disappear. Systems are stubborn like that. They outlive their usefulness and continue operating out of muscle memory. People keep doing things because they have always done them, and because nobody is quite sure what replaces them. Along the Nile, the infrastructure remained. Docks, storehouses, administrative buildings repurposed, reused, quietly aging. Some were maintained, others weren't, but their presence shaped movement and settlement long after gold shipments thinned. Former mining routes stayed open, not because they led to gold anymore, but because roads, once made, tend to invite use. Caravans passed through carrying other goods. Salt, stone, livestock. The desert didn't suddenly become friendlier, but familiarity counts for something. Old mining settlements partially emptied, then stabilized at smaller sizes. Families stayed. Children grew up without ever seeing gold extracted in meaningful quantities. Stories filled the gap. Tales of how things used to be. How busy it was. How important it felt. These stories weren't bitter. Mostly, they were matter of fact. Gold had come. Gold had gone. The land remained. People adjusted. In Egypt proper, the memory of gold remained embedded in religious practice. Ritual language persisted. Hymns referenced abundance even when abundance was theoretical. Tradition has a long shelf life. Temples kept their old inventories, even when the objects themselves wore thin. A statue described as gilded might now be more memory than metal. But the description stayed. Words preserved what materials no longer fully could. Scribes continued to write. About other things now. Taxes, grain, water levels. But their methods remained shaped by centuries of gold accounting. Careful notation. Red ink for emphasis. Multiple copies stored separately. The habits learned counting gold proved useful everywhere else. This is how influence lingers. Not through objects, but through behavior. The Nile trade adapted smoothly. Boats that once carried gold carried grain or stone. Crews passed down knowledge unchanged. How to read currents. How to tie up safely. Where to stop. The river didn't care what was on board. From the perspective of someone living along the Nile generations later, gold boats were history. Something grandparents mentioned. Something written about. Not something you expected to see. Foreign travelers occasionally commented on this. Roman writers noted Egypt's past wealth with a tone of detached curiosity. It was impressive, but no longer threatening. Egypt had become a province. A useful one. A stable one. Gold was part of its story, not its future. Nubia itself followed its own path. Gold continued to matter locally, but without the same external pressure. Regional powers rose and fell. Trade networks shifted south and east. The world widened. What's striking is how little nostalgia appears in official records. No laments. No declarations of loss. Administrations don't grieve. They adjust. People might feel change, but paperwork rarely does. Instead, gold became symbolic in retrospect. A marker of a golden age, quite literally. Writers looked back and simplified. Abundance was emphasized. Complexity was ignored. The long, quiet labor vanished from memory. This selective memory shaped later perceptions of Egypt. A land of unimaginable wealth. Endless gold. Monumental splendor. The reality had always been more measured. More fragile. But myth is more comfortable. Archaeology would later complicate this picture. evidence of mining sites, harsh conditions, declining yields. But these insights came much later. For most of history, gold remained an idea more than a system. And yet, the Nile kept carrying traces. Sediments held flecks of metal. Old routes hinted at former importance. Place names preserved functions no longer relevant. Even today, traces remain. Not always visible. Sometimes buried. Sometimes overlooked. But the pattern is there if you know how to look. Rivers remember even when people forget. The gold boats themselves left little physical evidence. Ropes decay. The river reclaims. But their impact survives in infrastructure, in habits, in the shape of administration. It's easy to focus on the shine, the finished objects, the masks, the jewelry. But the quieter legacy is more enduring. A culture of logistics, of careful movement, of trusting a river to connect distant lives. This trust shaped Egypt profoundly. It made long-distance planning possible. It encouraged centralization. It allowed abstraction. Gold could be far away and still be counted, still be owned, still be promised. When gold faded, that mindset remained. The idea that resources could be managed across space and time. That authority could extend far beyond direct visibility. This is not glamorous, but it is powerful. For ordinary people, the legacy was subtler. Source: ruins. Occasional discoveries of old workings in the desert. Children playing near abandoned structures without knowing why they existed. Life went on. Crops were planted. Boats moved. The Nile did what it always did. In this sense, the end of Nubian gold's dominance wasn't really an end. It was a transformation, a rebalancing, one resource stepping back to make room for others. History prefers clear conclusions. Reality prefers continuity. As we drift toward the final stretch of our story, it's worth holding on to this image. A system that once felt essential becoming background. Not erased, just absorbed into the flow of time. The river flows. Boats come and go. Empires rise and recede. And somewhere beneath it all, the memory of gold still glints faintly, carried forward not in metal, but in the quiet structures it left behind. Long after Nubian gold stopped arriving in meaningful quantities, its presence lingered in small, unremarkable things. Not the famous artifacts, not the museum pieces, but ordinary objects that had once brushed against wealth and then settled into obscurity. Temple tools, for example, chisels, burnishers, wooden mallets used to apply gold leaf. These tools outlived their purpose. Some were reused for other tasks. Some were stored away and forgotten. Others were repaired repeatedly, long past the point when replacement would have been easier, because habit is persuasive. A tool that once touched gold carried a certain quiet prestige. Even if gold was no longer involved, the tool's history mattered to the people using it. This wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. Everyone knew. In households near administrative centers, old containers remained in use. Jars that once held gold dust or measured consignments were repurposed. Grain, water. Their original function faded, but their shape remained. Durable, familiar, comforting. These objects did not announce their past. They just existed, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. A storage jar might still be described as the gold jar centuries after it had last seen anything more valuable than lentils. Language held on longer than materials. Words associated with gold persisted in metaphor, in proverbs, in administrative phrasing. Something reliable was still as steady as the gold boats. Something precious was worthy of the river journey. These phrases were used casually, without awareness of their origin. That's how language works. It remembers for us when we no longer feel like remembering. In some places, small-scale gold work continued. Local artisans reused old material, melted down fragments, repaired heirlooms. Gold was not gone. It was just quieter, more personal, less imperial. A ring repaired 3 times over 200 years tells a different story than a burial mask. It speaks of continuity, not spectacle, of maintenance rather than display. Even in death, gold's role shifted. Burials became simpler. Gold items were fewer and more restrained. When present, they often carried family significance rather than royal symbolism. An earring, a pendant, something recognizable. This wasn't framed as decline. It was framed as appropriateness. Changing customs. Changing values. The past was respected, but not replicated. The people handling these objects were not thinking about Nubia, or imperial logistics. They were thinking about daily life. Repairs. Inheritance. Keeping things functional. And yet, those earlier systems had shaped the world they inhabited. Roads existed where roads had been needed. Administrative habits persisted. Expectations around documentation, measurement, and oversight remained deeply ingrained. Gold had trained people to think in terms of accumulation and movement. Even when gold was no longer the focus, that mindset endured. Occasionally, a discovery interrupted this quiet continuity. A forgotten hoard. A collapsed tomb partially exposed by erosion. A piece of gold emerging unexpectedly from sand or stone. These moments caused brief excitement, local interest, official attention, sometimes intervention, but they rarely led to systemic change. One find did not restart an industry. It became an exception, not a revival. Officials handled these finds carefully. Records were updated. Ownership was determined. The gold entered circulation again, briefly, before being absorbed into whatever system currently existed. It did not restore the past. It joined the present. Stories grew around these discoveries. Exaggerated. Simplified. Gold had always inspired storytelling. But these stories were quieter than earlier legends. More local. Less imperial. Children heard them and imagined a world of endless wealth that had existed before their time. Adults listened politely and returned to their work. Life, after all, required attention. The Nile continued to offer reminders. Occasional flecks of gold in sediment. Glimmers that caught the eye and then disappeared. The river had always carried gold in one form or another. That fact didn't change. Only its significance did. Travelers passing through Egypt in later centuries often remarked on its history more than its present. The grandeur of the past overshadowed the reality they observed. This wasn't unique to Egypt. It happens everywhere with long histories. What mattered locally was stability, predictability, the river flooding when expected, crops growing, boats moving. Gold was no longer central to that equation. And yet, the idea of gold as a stabilizing force persisted. Even when not physically present, it remained part of how people understood wealth and security. A mental anchor. This is the strange afterlife of resources. They shape thought patterns long after their material dominance fades. They influence decisions, expectations, and metaphors. They become cultural infrastructure. By this point in our drift, Nubian gold has transformed completely. From raw or to imperial backbone to symbolic memory. It no longer drives events, but it quietly informs them. The boats that once carried it have become generic in memory. Just boats. The river is still the star. Always has been. As night deepens in our story, imagine one of those ordinary objects. A jar. A ring. A tool. Sitting quietly, used daily, its connection to gold unremarked upon. History doesn't always end with ruins or revelations. Sometimes it ends with reuse, with continuity disguised as change. And as the Nile flows on, carrying whatever the moment requires, the legacy of those silent gold boats remains, not in treasure, but in the steady habits of a world that learned, long ago, how to move value gently through time. When gold stopped arriving in quantities worth announcing, silence filled the space it left. Not literal silence. Life along the Nile was never quiet. But the silence of records, the absence of emphasis, the missing excitement that once surrounded shipments, donations, and displays. This kind of silence is easy to miss. Historians notice it later. People living through it usually don't. They just stop writing certain things down with enthusiasm. Gold entries shrink. Descriptions flatten. What was once highlighted becomes routine, and then barely worth mentioning. Scribes adjusted first, as they always did. Gold no longer dominated ledgers. It became one line among many. Still important. Still measured. But no longer exceptional. The handwriting didn't change. The attention did. This is how decline often looks in bureaucratic cultures. Not collapse. Not chaos. Just a gradual reduction in emotional investment. When resources become scarce, administrators become careful. When they become irrelevant, administrators become indifferent. Temple records reflect this shift gently. Early texts speak proudly of donations. Later ones mention maintenance, repair, preservation, words associated with conservation rather than expansion. The gods, it seems, had learned to live with less. Ritual calendars remained intact. Festivals were still held. Hymns were still sung. Gold objects were still referenced. But sometimes the reference was symbolic rather than literal. A statue described as shining might no longer do so physically. But the description stayed. Because descriptions are easier to maintain than materials. Priests were very good at this. Religion thrives on continuity of language. If the words remain the same, change can pass unnoticed. This wasn't deception. It was adaptation. Royal correspondence also softened. Earlier letters boasted. Later ones reassured. Stability was emphasized over splendor. Legitimacy was grounded in tradition rather than abundance. Kings wanted to be seen as caretakers, not conquerors of wealth. Foreign rulers followed similar patterns. Roman governors focused on order and revenue, not display. Gold mattered insofar as it could be taxed or redistributed. Its symbolic value was secondary. For local elites, this meant recalibration. Status could no longer rely solely on gold. Land ownership mattered more. Administrative positions. Proximity to authority. Wealth became quieter, less visible, more embedded. This shift affected social behavior. Public displays diminished. Private accumulation increased. Gold objects were smaller, easier to hide, easier to pass down discreetly. Wealth became personal rather than performative. The boats, meanwhile, were just boats. They carried what they were told to carry. Grain, stone, people. Occasionally gold, but without ceremony. No one paused to watch them anymore. No one counted their arrival as an event. This lack of attention didn't mean the system had failed. It meant it had been absorbed into the background. When something works well enough for long enough, it becomes invisible. In Nubia, silence took a different form. External pressure eased. Mining slowed. Some sites were abandoned entirely. Others continued on a smaller scale. The land recovered in places. Not fully, but enough to change how people interacted with it. Local narratives shifted. Gold became a part of heritage rather than livelihood. Something ancestors dealt with. Something associated with outside powers. Pride mixed with distance. Oral traditions preserved fragments. Stories of immense wealth. Of foreign interest. Of long journeys. But the details blurred. Boats became symbolic. Rivers became characters. Memory softened reality. Back in Egypt, children grew up without direct experience of gold abundance. They learned about it the way modern children learn about vanished industries. As something that shaped the past but did not define the present. This didn't produce disappointment. It produced normalcy. You don't miss what you never had. You adapt to the world you inherit. Silence settled into architecture too. Grand storehouses became smaller offices. Empty spaces were repurposed. Walls were patched rather than rebuilt. Nothing dramatic, just gradual reuse. Archaeologically, this creates confusion. Later layers are thinner, less distinct, harder to interpret. Decline leaves fewer traces than growth. It's less interested in being remembered. And yet, this phase lasted longer than the age of abundance. Quiet sustainability outlived dramatic wealth. That's often the case. The Nile continued its cycles. Floods came and went. Communities adjusted. Administration persisted. Gold had once been central to this rhythm. Now it was incidental. This doesn't make the earlier centuries meaningless. It contextualizes them. It reminds us that even the most powerful systems are temporary, and that their afterlives can be calmer than their peaks. If you were to stand along the river during this later period, you wouldn't feel like you were witnessing the end of anything. You'd see boats, fields, people working, the usual. That's the strange comfort of continuity. It dulls awareness of loss. It replaces drama with routine. As our drift continues, we move further away from gold itself and closer to the mindset it left behind. The habits of administration, the trust in the river, the expectation that movement, not accumulation, sustains societies. In the next chapter, we'll settle into that mindset fully, into a world where gold is memory and the river remains the only constant worth watching. For now, let the silence settle gently. Not emptiness, just the absence of emphasis. The kind of quiet that tells you a story has moved on without ever announcing that it was leaving. By this point, the river has carried countless shipments, temples have gleamed and dulled, and gold has moved from material abundance to symbolic presence. Yet the story is incomplete without considering the ordinary people whose lives were quietly shaped by this flow. Not kings, not priests, not foreign envoys. The laborers, boat crews, artisans, and families who lived alongside the Nile, these are the people whose patterns of work and life were defined, if subtly, by gold's passage. Consider the boat crews first. They did not ride on the currents merely as passengers. Their days began long before dawn, checking hulls, repairing sails, and balancing cargo. Gold, grain, or stone, the river did not discriminate. Yet the presence of gold introduced careful procedures. Cargo had to be accounted for meticulously. Boats could not be overloaded. Security mattered, though subtly. The discipline imposed by valuable cargo taught crews a rhythm of precision that continued even when the shipments were less impressive. Food and water were always a concern. Long stretches of the Nile could be unforgiving. Crews learned to ration, to plan, to manage minor disasters without raising alarms. That skill, honed over centuries, carried forward to transport of other goods. The lessons of gold were embedded in habits rather than consciousness. Miners in Nubia had lives governed by the extraction process. Early mornings in arid pits, late evenings of grinding ore. Children sometimes accompanied parents, learning from observation and repetition. Gender roles were rigid but practical. Women carried water, prepared meals, and occasionally participated in sorting and washing ore. Their labor was invisible in most records, but crucial for survival and efficiency. The community itself revolved around production rhythms that responded to distant demands. Life was structured by a commodity they rarely, if ever, touched. Artisans, too, were deeply affected. Carpenters, metalworkers, and gilders learned techniques whose precision was dictated by gold. Tools had to be exact. Measurements were exacting. Mistakes were costly, not just materially but in prestige and reputation. When gold became scarcer, artisans still followed these habits, applying them to less precious materials. Their craftsmanship retained a trace of former wealth in standards and expectations. Families, especially children, experienced gold indirectly. Growing up with stories of abundant wealth, they internalized hierarchies and social expectations. They saw their parents toil, noted the rhythms of production and administration, and understood intuitively that their society functioned through both visible and invisible labor. Gold taught lessons in patience, diligence, and hierarchy without being directly present. Religious practice reinforced this. Temples demanded offerings. Ceremonies followed predictable patterns. Gold objects, whether real or symbolic, mediated human interaction with the divine. The belief that wealth, whether material or abstracted, signified favor shaped moral and ethical understanding, subtly guiding behavior. People learned that effort and ritual were sometimes more important than result. Local markets adjusted as well. Traders understood the flow of goods. Gold influenced currency, value, and perception. Even when gold became symbolic rather than abundant, the network of commerce retained lessons of accounting, exchange, and trust. Economic habits persisted long after physical gold shipments diminished. And through it all, the river acted as a stabilizing presence. It dictated timing, shaped settlements, and enabled long-term planning. People organized their lives around its predictable yet occasionally capricious rhythms. The lessons of flow, adaptation, patience, and observation were as tangible as any coin. Even the decline of gold's dominance didn't remove its impact. Laborers still followed systems established for transporting it. Artisans still measured carefully. Families retained inherited social norms and expectations. The past persisted in habits, memory, and the organization of space. Gold had left an imprint deeper than materiality on cognition, behavior, and culture. Quietly, subtly, these ordinary lives sustained civilization. Gold had been the spark, but the routine, the adaptation, and the discipline became the enduring legacy. People kept the system alive, even when the original purpose, display, power, or ritual was less urgent. And so, as night deepens in our story, imagine a miner setting down tools after a long day, a boat crew tying off a vessel at dusk, children playing near the riverbank. The physical gold may have been elsewhere or gone entirely, but its lessons, carried in habit and expectation, lingered, shaping lives in ways that were almost invisible, yet profoundly enduring. By now, it's clear that Nubian gold was never just a commodity. Its movement down the Nile shaped more than temples, palaces, or tombs. It orchestrated a rhythm for daily life that persisted long after the metal itself became scarce. The term choreography fits, because life along the river evolved into a quiet, predictable dance. People moved according to the demands of seasons, shipments, labor, and ritual, often without consciously realizing that gold had taught them the steps. Miners followed a consistent routine, dictated both by necessity and by expectations established over generations. Before dawn, they prepared tools. They checked rudimentary shelters and storage pits. Water, scarce and precious, was rationed carefully. Then came hours of hard, repetitive labor, extracting rock, breaking it down, washing, or separating what could be valuable. Children shadowed parents, learning the rhythms naturally. This wasn't formal education. It was habit forming, a life molded by cadence, patience, and endurance. Boat crews mirrored similar discipline. Their days began with maintenance, checking hull integrity, inspecting sails, and ensuring ropes were secure. Cargo, whether grain or the occasional residual gold, was balanced meticulously. Boats moved slowly, deliberately, because speed could be dangerous. Pacing was internalized, a tacit agreement among crew members. The river itself became a silent director, dictating when to push forward and when to wait. Crews adapted to winds, currents, and seasonal flooding, developing a quiet awareness that allowed them to function with minimal oversight. Artisans, although physically removed from the extraction and transport process, were just as constrained by routine. Carpenters, gilders, and metalworkers adhered to precise methods. A misapplied gold leaf, or a poorly measured joint in a ceremonial object, could render months of labor moot. Even when gold was scarce, the standards remained. Tools that had once been used for gilding now shaped wood or tin, but with the same meticulous care. Their hands retained the memory of past abundance. Families also participated in this choreography, subtly and invisibly. Women managed households, prepared meals, and carried out the invisible labor that sustained communities. Men performed laborious tasks in mines or on boats, while children observed and learned. Social hierarchies were reinforced through subtle cues: proximity to leadership, access to resources, and participation in ritual. Gold, real or symbolic, reinforced these hierarchies, ensuring that everyone knew their place in the rhythm of society. Religious observance added another layer. Ceremonies were predictable, with specific offerings and sequences. Gold objects, when available, were placed deliberately to reflect hierarchy and devotion. But even when gold was absent or symbolic, the ceremonies persisted. Structure mattered more than the materials themselves. People internalized these routines, and over time, rituals became as much about maintaining social and psychological stability as about actual wealth. Markets also reflected this choreography. Traders and merchants adjusted their schedules to match river flows and harvest cycles. Contracts, exchanges, and payments were standardized to reduce uncertainty. Even the decline of physical gold did not disrupt the mental frameworks established during centuries of trade. Trust, documentation, and accountability, concepts honed by centuries of transporting valuable commodities, remained embedded in commercial behavior. In essence, the lives of ordinary people evolved into a dance where every movement had been subtly influenced by the imperatives of gold. Even after abundance faded, the steps remained: early mornings, repetitive labor, careful observation, and the pacing dictated by the river. No one explicitly taught these lessons. They were absorbed through practice, observation, and expectation. It is remarkable how systems created for wealth accumulation produced enduring human rhythms. Patience, attention to detail, adaptation, and endurance. These traits were cultivated not by philosophy or pedagogy, but by everyday interaction with the movement of resources. Gold may have inspired the system, but its persistence depended on people internalizing and performing the routines without pause. Tonight, as you imagine this daily choreography, picture miners washing, or as sunlight begins to warm the desert, boat crews adjusting sails in perfect sync with the gentle current, artisans shaping objects with careful precision, and families carrying out the routines that keep communities alive. The river moves steadily, quietly orchestrating a flow of life shaped by centuries of expectation, habit, and subtle discipline. In the next chapter, we will observe the interplay between labor, ritual, and administration, focusing on how these overlapping routines reinforced the continuity of society even as material wealth became increasingly symbolic rather than tangible. By this stage, life along the Nile had become a delicate balance of labor, ritual, and administration, a system that, while born of necessity and wealth, had evolved into a quiet, self-sustaining network. Gold no longer dominated every transaction, but the structures it had instilled remained intact, subtly influencing behavior across generations. The interplay of these elements is where the river's long-term influence becomes most apparent. Labor provided the foundation. Miners, boat crews, and artisans all followed routines established over centuries. Miners woke before dawn to extract or wash it and separate particles with painstaking care. Each motion was part of a larger, predictable sequence, embedded in long-standing expectations. The same laborers who had once transported gold now handled stone, grain, or other resources, but the rhythm persisted. It was a living memory of past abundance. Boat crews carried this rhythm forward. They coordinated with miners, scribes, and local administrators, ensuring that goods reached their destinations without incident. Even when cargo shifted away from gold, protocols and procedures remained. Each crew member understood the flow of the river, the timing of locks and docks, and the responsibilities of keeping records accurate. The physical labor was intertwined with observation, planning, and documentation, a blend of muscle and mind. Administration acted as the nervous system of this network. Scribes meticulously recorded inventory, monitored departures and arrivals, and communicated with higher authorities. Their work required attention to detail that had been cultivated through centuries of gold management. Mistakes could have been costly in the past, and though gold was scarcer now, the same habits of accountability persisted. These records not only organized labor but also maintained social hierarchies and the rhythm of the community. Ritual added another dimension. Ceremonies punctuated work cycles, providing social cohesion and continuity. Offerings to gods, whether symbolic or literal, reinforced the authority of leaders and the social structure. Gold, once a prominent part of these rituals, was now often replaced by modest items or symbolic representations. Yet the actions themselves, processions, prayers, and precise placement of objects, remained deeply embedded in daily life. They provided structure, reassurance, and a sense of purpose, connecting ordinary laborers to broader societal rhythms. The overlap of labor, ritual, and administration created a resilient system. Each element supported the others. Laborers relied on administrative guidance for planning and allocation of resources. Administrators depended on consistent labor and adherence to protocols. Ritual offered psychological reinforcement, reminding participants that their work, though often invisible to elites, was valued and meaningful. Even minor disruptions tested this choreography. A delayed shipment, a sick boat crew member, or a miscalculation in labor allocation could ripple across the system. Yet because the routines were deeply internalized, adjustments were made with minimal fuss. Laborers worked harder, scribes recalculated inventories, and rituals proceeded as scheduled. Stability was maintained not through coercion alone, but through ingrained practice and shared understanding. Local communities absorbed these dynamics in subtle ways. Women and children contributed indirectly through household management, food preparation, and observation of routines. Their participation ensured continuity, even when direct involvement in labor or administration was limited. Skills, norms, and expectations were transmitted organically, reinforcing the persistent rhythm of life along the Nile. This interweaving of tasks also cultivated patience and observation. The river did not hurry. Boats followed currents, miners adjusted to the weather, and rituals unfolded on set schedules. People learned to anticipate, to respond to subtle cues, and to sustain effort over long periods. These skills, developed in response to gold-related systems, persisted long after material wealth faded. Even as centuries passed and Nubian gold became more symbolic than tangible, the patterns it had established endured. Life along the river remained structured, organized, and quietly disciplined. Daily routines, ceremonial observances, and administrative record-keeping were no longer about gold alone. They were about the continuity and stability of society itself. As you imagine this scene, picture overlapping movements. Miners bending over crushing stones, scribes tallying records under low lamplight, boat crews adjusting ropes with the precision of practice, and priests conducting rituals with measured gestures. Each action is small, almost imperceptible on its own, but together they form a harmonious choreography that defines the daily life of communities along the Nile. By this stage in our story, gold no longer flows in abundance down the Nile. Its physical presence has diminished, yet its memory remains deeply embedded in the consciousness of the people. This memory is not dramatic. It is quiet, persistent, and often unspoken, carried through habits, stories, rituals, and social structures. In many ways, gold has transformed from a material resource into a cultural and symbolic one, influencing life long after the mines and boats ceased to dominate daily routines. Communities along the Nile remembered abundance not as nostalgia, but as a framework for understanding their world. Stories of previous kings, of temple offerings, and of distant mines shaped expectations. Children learned tales of wealth, of diligence rewarded, and of the invisible labor that made it possible. These narratives were not moralizing or sensationalized. They were simply facts of experience distilled into oral history. Ritual became the primary vessel for memory. Ceremonies, offerings, and temple observances preserved the cultural significance of gold even when the material itself was scarce. Symbolic representations of wealth, small gilded objects, painted depictions, or simply ritual language, conveyed authority and legitimacy. Priests and administrators perpetuated these practices with a quiet understanding. The structure mattered more than the substance. Gold had taught them this lesson, and the lesson endured. Adaptation became equally crucial. People adjusted to changing circumstances without disrupting societal rhythm. Mining settlements repurposed their buildings. Boat crews transported different cargo. Artisans applied their meticulous skills to other materials. Social hierarchies persisted, even if they were no longer reinforced by lavish displays of wealth. Gold's decline forced innovation and flexibility, but the underlying system, the expectations, routines, and structures, remained remarkably stable. This duality of memory and adaptation created a subtle kind of resilience. Gold's past abundance provided a benchmark, a standard by which efficiency and order could be measured. Its absence forced people to internalize lessons learned from centuries of handling valuable cargo. Routines persisted because they worked, not because the original reward remained. Labor, ritual, and administration had become self-sustaining, a legacy of gold that no longer required gold to function. Communities also used memory to reinforce identity. The knowledge that their ancestors had handled extraordinary wealth instilled a sense of competence and continuity. Even if the mines were exhausted and the temples less opulent, people understood the standards set before them. This understanding shaped expectations for work, social behavior, and governance. Gold became an abstract teacher, its lessons encoded in the practices and perceptions of ordinary life. Economic behavior reflected the same principle. Traders and administrators continued meticulous record-keeping and careful planning. The concepts of accountability, trust, and measured risk, originally honed through handling gold, remained central to local commerce. Even in scarcity, the logic of precision endured, demonstrating that the legacy of a resource often outlives the resource itself. The river, ever consistent, became a living archive. Its currents carried not only goods but also the accumulated knowledge of generations. Boat crews understood timing and seasonal changes, just as their ancestors had, long after gold had ceased to dominate cargo. The physical river mirrored the continuity of cultural memory. Steady, reliable, shaping life subtly but profoundly. Gold's symbolic weight extended into governance and social cohesion. Leaders used ritualized displays and historical narrative to legitimize authority, even when lavish material wealth was absent. People recognized and accepted hierarchy because it was familiar, because it had been sustained by practice over centuries. Memory itself became a stabilizing force, transmitted quietly through social norms, ceremonies, and daily routines. Finally, the transformation of gold into symbol allowed communities to navigate scarcity with grace. Where once abundance had dictated social and economic structures, symbolic wealth now guided behavior, provided cohesion, and maintained rhythm. The material resource was gone, but its lessons, discipline, patience, precision, and continuity remained embedded in human practice. As you drift further into this story, imagine generations internalizing the patterns set by something they rarely encountered directly. Miners and boat crews, artisans and scribes, parents and children, all moving through lives structured by memories of abundance. Gold itself may be absent, but its shadow shapes behavior, expectation, and ritual. As the centuries passed, the world along the Nile continued to change. Dynasties rose and fell. Foreign powers arrived and departed. Climate shifted subtly. Yet, life retained a remarkable continuity, largely because the rhythms established during the height of Nubian gold trade had been internalized by communities. These routines, labor, ritual, and administration, provided a scaffold that made adaptation possible without chaos. Miners, boat crews, and artisans adjusted to new demands. Mines that had once yielded gold now offered other minerals or were abandoned entirely. Some communities shifted toward agriculture or trade in more mundane goods, like grain or stone. Even as the objects carried on the boats changed, the underlying patterns of movement and coordination remained. Crews still woke early, checked equipment, and followed the river's rhythm. Laborers still adhered to routines refined over generations. Adaptation did not erase the past, it incorporated it. Religious and ceremonial life mirrored this pattern. Temples and priests continued to structure ritual around cycles of work and river movement. Offerings became less about material display and more about maintaining symbolic consistency. Gold's scarcity did not halt devotion, it reshaped expression. Smaller items, representations of wealth, or even simple gestures preserved the sense of sacred order. Rituals adapted but remained predictable, reinforcing social cohesion even during periods of scarcity or political uncertainty. Administrative systems also absorbed these shifts. Scribes adjusted ledgers, tracking diverse commodities instead of gold. Local officials coordinated labor and transport, ensuring efficiency even without lavish resources. The bureaucratic habits honed during centuries of gold management persisted because they were effective. Measurement, accounting, and oversight continued, demonstrating that systems created for one purpose can endure and function in entirely new contexts. Social structures remained stable, partly due to these routines. Hierarchies, authority, and roles persisted even as wealth became less concentrated. People understood the rules of engagement because they were embedded in daily practice. Children learned the expectations through observation, parents reinforced them through instruction and example, and communities continued to operate smoothly. Gold may have disappeared from everyday life, but its behavioral imprint was permanent. Economic adaptation was equally subtle. Traders diversified cargo, negotiators established new terms, and markets evolved to reflect changing demands. Practices learned in the era of gold, record-keeping, trust networks, careful scheduling remained vital. Scarcity encouraged creativity without dismantling the framework that had supported centuries of prosperity. Environmental rhythms reinforced these patterns. The Nile flooded, receded, and shifted course in cycles familiar to those who lived along it. People organized work, ritual, and trade around these natural cadences, much as they had during the height of gold transport. The river's constancy offered stability that offset political and material fluctuations. Gold may have been intermittent, but the Nile was predictable, and predictability became the backbone of adaptation. Even cultural memory played a role. Tales of past abundance, of successful management, and of careful observation circulated quietly, reminding communities of standards to uphold. These narratives shaped expectations and inspired continuity. They were not nostalgic in a dramatic sense. They were practical guides for maintaining order and rhythm in a changing world. In essence, communities along the Nile learned to adapt without losing themselves. They preserved structure, habits, and social cohesion, even as the tangible rewards that once reinforced them faded. Gold became less of a physical driver and more of a conceptual one, an invisible instructor, teaching patience, diligence, and foresight across generations. Imagine standing on a riverbank at dusk. Workers return from fields and mines. Boat crews tie up after a steady journey. Artisans close their workshops. Temples settle into evening rituals. Life continues, predictable and calm. The routines that sustained centuries of gold transport now carry communities through a world where wealth is less visible, but the rhythm of human effort and organization remains unbroken. By this point, we begin to see the full measure of what Nubian gold left behind, not in piles of treasure, but in the intangible structures of society. Communities along the Nile had inherited more than material wealth. They inherited rhythms, habits, and a sense of order that became deeply ingrained in daily life. These elements together formed a kind of cultural resilience, enabling societies to persist through change, scarcity, and shifting political landscapes. Memory played a subtle but essential role. Stories of past abundance, of kings and priests who oversaw grand shipments, and of artisans who mastered precise techniques were passed down quietly. Children absorbed these stories without formal instruction, internalizing standards and expectations. The past shaped perception, teaching lessons without explicit guidance. Gold itself was no longer necessary. The memory of it, carefully preserved, carried the weight of history. Routine reinforced memory. Daily patterns of labor, administration, and ritual were not random. They were echoes of practices that had evolved around the movement of gold. Miners, boat crews, and scribes repeated actions learned over generations, whether transporting grain, repairing boats, or recording accounts. Each repetition was a thread connecting the present to the past, ensuring continuity even as material wealth became less central. Ritual amplified both memory and routine. Ceremonies, processions, and temple observances offered structured, predictable moments that reinforced social cohesion. Even when offerings were modest, the gestures carried symbolic weight, preserving the legitimacy of authority and reinforcing community expectations. People moved through these rituals as naturally as they moved through daily work, sustaining a shared understanding of order and responsibility. The interplay between memory, routine, and ritual created a buffer against disruption. Political changes, fluctuations in resource availability, or environmental shifts could have destabilized communities, but the ingrained structures allowed societies to absorb shocks. Laborers continued their work. Administrators continued recording. Rituals continued observing. The framework endured because it had been internalized over generations. Artisans and laborers, in particular, exemplified this resilience. Even when the objects they produced no longer carried the same material value, the standards of precision and care persisted. Tools that had once shaped gold now shaped stone, wood, or simple household items. The act of working according to established methods reinforced skills, discipline, and cultural identity. The function may have changed, but the structure endured. Economic behavior reflected a similar pattern. Market networks adapted to scarcity, but the principles learned from gold transport, trust, accountability, careful record-keeping, and coordinated timing remained central. Scarcity did not undermine competence. It highlighted the importance of enduring habits and institutional memory. Cultural resilience also had a psychological dimension. Communities understood that change was natural, and yet that stability could be maintained through consistent practice. People accepted the ebb and flow of resources and leadership, confident that their routines and rituals would continue to provide structure and meaning. Gold had trained them to understand value not only materially but symbolically as a set of behaviors and expectations. Even the river contributed to resilience. Its predictable cycles of flooding, receding, and seasonal variation offered a temporal framework that reinforced societal rhythms. People organized work, transport, and ritual around these natural patterns. The Nile, constant and indifferent, provided a steady reference point, anchoring routines and amplifying the lessons of gold's past presence. In essence, the legacy of Nubian gold was less about wealth accumulation and more about habit formation, social cohesion, and memory. Communities became adept at preserving the lessons of history while navigating present realities. Material scarcity did not threaten continuity because the structures supporting society were no longer dependent solely on gold. They were embedded in practice, expectation, and cultural understanding. As night deepens in our story, imagine a community along the Nile moving through the familiar cadence of daily life. Boat crews securing vessels, artisans closing workshops, temple rituals proceeding without disruption. The shimmer of gold may no longer be present, but the lessons it instilled ripple quietly through every action, maintaining order and stability. By now, it becomes apparent that the legacy of Nubian gold extended far beyond the immediate banks of the Nile. The patterns of labor, administration, and ritual that had evolved around its transport did not stay confined to a single region. Instead, they quietly shaped governance, trade, and societal expectations across neighboring lands, leaving an imprint that was more procedural and cultural than material. Trade networks were the first to carry these lessons outward. Merchants and emissaries who had participated in gold transport traveled to distant settlements, carrying with them habits of meticulous record-keeping, careful accounting, and precise scheduling. These practices were adopted not because of the inherent value of gold, but because they proved effective for managing any valuable commodity. The principles honed along the Nile became templates for broader regional commerce. Political administration also absorbed these patterns. Local rulers who had learned to oversee gold shipments understood the importance of standardization and accountability. They applied these methods to tax collection, resource allocation, and dispute resolution. Even when dealing with entirely different economies, grain, livestock, or imported goods, the organizational techniques remained. The memory of gold structured their thinking, enabling consistency in governance across shifting political landscapes. Cultural influence spread subtly through ritual as well. Observances once centered on offerings of gold became symbolic, yet the formalized sequences and protocols were preserved. Neighboring communities, inspired by the stability and prestige of Egyptian ceremonial practice, adopted similar ritual structures. The exact materials may have differed, but the discipline and predictability remained. Ritual became a vector for transmitting the organizational habits instilled by gold without requiring physical access to the metal itself. Education and apprenticeship extended the reach further. Young scribes, artisans, and boat crews learned from mentors who had internalized centuries of procedural knowledge. By passing skills and routines along, these communities ensured that practices optimized for wealth management could be applied in new contexts. This created a resilient knowledge network, not written in stone or gold, but embodied in behavior, expectation, and craft. Even in distant regions, the psychological imprint of gold persisted. Societies learned to value diligence, patience, and attention to detail, recognizing that wealth, however defined, required sustained, structured effort. Habits shaped by centuries of handling gold became generalized strategies for managing resources, whether material, social, or symbolic. Environmental adaptation also traveled with these lessons. The precise coordination required to navigate seasonal river flows, floods, and droughts along the Nile provided a blueprint for responding to natural variability in other riverine or agrarian regions. Timing, observation, and planning, once essential for gold transport, proved valuable wherever communities depended on cyclical environmental patterns. Trade diplomacy carried memory in yet another form. Agreements, contracts, and exchanges required trust, clarity, and enforceable standards. The credibility cultivated during the era of gold facilitated negotiation and cooperation across borders. Societies became accustomed to working with predictable systems, valuing procedural integrity above immediate spectacle. Gold may have been absent, but the administrative lessons endured. Social norms also reflected this outward influence. The distinction between visible and invisible labor, the emphasis on routine over display, and the integration of symbolic value into daily life, all traits forged during the Golden Age, emerged in neighboring regions. Communities learned that stability and efficiency often relied on quiet, consistent practice rather than ostentation. In short, Nubian gold left a legacy that transcended its material presence. Its influence flowed outward like the river itself, shaping economies, governance, social structures, and cultural expectations across vast regions. Physical gold may have been limited to certain points along the Nile, but the habits, routines, and principles it instilled traveled far, quietly embedding themselves in human behavior. As the night drifts on and you imagine these distant communities, picture scribes in small towns counting grain with the same meticulous care once applied to gold, artisans following inherited precision in unfamiliar workshops, and traders negotiating across borders with trust learned from centuries of disciplined administration. Gold is gone, yet its lessons persist, guiding life quietly and effectively beyond the shores of its origin. As we continue drifting down this historical current, it becomes clear that the lessons of Nubian gold were not limited to immediate economic or administrative outcomes. They shaped societal expectations across generations. What people anticipated from life, from labor, and from leadership was subtly informed by practices and rhythms that had evolved around gold transport, long after the metal itself had lost its prominence. Children grew up observing routines established by their elders. They saw miners and boat crews follow precise schedules, scribes tally accounts with careful attention, and artisans repeat tasks with exacting precision. These repeated patterns conveyed implicit lessons. Diligence matters, attention to detail is rewarded, and patience is necessary for long-term stability. Gold may have been scarce, but its behavioral legacy endured in these quiet transmissions of expectation. Education in its informal form reinforced these norms. Apprentices watched mentors work methodically. Young scribes copied ledgers under supervision. Children helped in households, absorbing protocols for measurement, preparation, and organization. Through observation and repetition, generations internalized social and economic norms rooted in the management of precious resources. The principle that careful, consistent work maintains societal order became deeply embedded. Leadership expectations also reflected gold's influence. People came to understand that rulers were not merely defined by wealth, but by their ability to maintain systems reliably. A king or official was respected if they ensured order, facilitated trade, and preserved ritual continuity. Extravagance was secondary. The capacity to sustain structure, manage labor, and uphold ritual rhythm mattered more. Gold had originally signaled power, but over time, the expectation shifted from display to stewardship. These expectations shaped everyday behavior as well. Workers anticipated supervision, structured schedules, and procedural oversight. Communities expected predictability in trade, transport, and ritual. Ritualized practices and ceremonies provided reassurance, reinforcing the sense that life, though materially limited, was orderly and comprehensible. People could trust that systems would function because centuries of gold-centered habits had embedded reliability into social infrastructure. Cultural memory maintained these norms even during periods of scarcity or political turbulence. Oral narratives, local legends, and familial storytelling preserved lessons in patience, diligence, and proper conduct. Individuals recognized continuity not only as a link to the past but as a practical guide for navigating their present. Gold's material absence did not diminish its cognitive influence. Economic expectations mirrored these lessons. Traders continued to track goods meticulously, negotiate fairly, and rely on trust networks. Even when wealth became symbolic rather than tangible, behavior was disciplined by the standards inherited from gold-centered administration. Scarcity highlighted the value of routine, accuracy, and reliability. Wealth could fluctuate, but the procedures for managing it remained constant. Environmental awareness was similarly embedded. The predictable rhythms of the Nile, flooding, recession, seasonal variations, had once coordinated gold transport and labor. Communities learned to align activities with natural cycles, internalizing patterns that informed agriculture, construction, and riverine navigation. This alignment reinforced the sense that life could be managed carefully even when material circumstances shifted. In essence, generations grew up with expectations shaped by the past but applicable to present realities. They learned that social stability, economic efficiency, and cultural cohesion were products not of abundance alone, but of disciplined, routine practice. Gold had been the catalyst, but the lesson persisted independently of material resources. As you imagine this slow passage of time, picture families living in villages along the Nile, children observing daily rhythms, laborers performing predictable tasks, traders coordinating deliveries, and communities participating in ritual cycles. Each generation inherits not simply knowledge, but a framework of expectation, a set of invisible guidelines established centuries earlier by the quiet movement of gold. By the time we reach this chapter, it is evident that Nubian gold left an imprint far beyond material wealth. The rhythms, habits, and expectations it instilled allowed communities along the Nile to withstand political change with remarkable calm. Dynasties rose and fell, governors and foreign rulers came and went, yet life continued with surprising stability, thanks in part to the internalized structures established during the era of gold transport. Political upheaval often manifests in sudden disruptions, new leaders with different priorities, shifts in taxation, or changes in ceremonial practice. In many societies, such events could cause anxiety, inefficiency, or disorder. Along the Nile, however, the quiet legacies of gold helped buffer these impacts. Labor routines were already ingrained. Boat crews, miners, artisans, and scribes understood the importance of discipline, precision, and cooperation. Administrative protocols ensured continuity even when officials changed. Ritual offered additional reassurance. Ceremonies continued on schedule, regardless of the political climate. Temples remained centers of organization and memory. Even if kings or governors altered the distribution of material wealth, the symbolic structures persisted. People could rely on predictable sequences. Offerings, processions, and observances proceeded as expected, reinforcing social cohesion and mitigating anxiety. Ordinary communities adapted fluidly to change because expectations were internalized. Children learned that consistency, attention to detail, and patience mattered more than the appearance of wealth. Laborers and artisans followed inherited patterns, maintaining functional systems even when leadership priorities shifted. The implicit lessons of centuries of gold management, coordination, accountability, and procedural fidelity became a form of societal insurance. Economic networks demonstrated similar resilience. Traders continued exchanges, using record-keeping and trust networks developed during the era of gold to maintain stability. Market practices and logistical habits ensured continuity of supply, even when political oversight was inconsistent. Gold had once structured commerce. Its memory structured behavior long after the resource itself became rare. Environmental cycles also supported resilience. The predictable flooding and recession of the Nile provided a temporal framework that anchored daily life. Even in times of instability, communities could orient themselves around the river's rhythms, planning labor, transport, and ritual in harmony with natural cycles. Material scarcity and political uncertainty were mitigated by habitual practice and environmental consistency. Social norms reinforced these patterns. Hierarchies and roles persisted because they had been codified in routine. Leaders maintained authority through the performance of structured duties rather than ostentatious displays. Laborers, artisans, and boat crews continued executing their tasks with precision, ensuring that the society's machinery operated smoothly despite external changes. Gold may have declined, but the standards it established endured, fostering resilience. Cultural memory amplified this effect. Stories of past kings, successful shipments, and ceremonial triumphs provided context and reassurance. Communities understood that change was natural, but that underlying structures, labor routines, ritual cycles, and administrative habits remained reliable. The past became a guide for navigating uncertainty. In this way, the legacy of Nubian gold transformed into more than economic or symbolic value. It created systems of thought, behavior, and expectation capable of withstanding political flux. The lessons of coordination, precision, patience, and continuity became embedded in human practice, shaping how communities responded to upheaval without panic or collapse. As you imagine this scene, picture a village adjusting to a new governor, boat crews synchronizing cargo deliveries despite administrative reshuffling, artisans continuing their work undisturbed, and temple rituals proceeding without interruption. The material presence of gold may be minimal, but the structures it once required persist quietly, enabling resilience across generations. As we drift toward the conclusion of our journey, it becomes clear that Nubian gold's story is not one of sudden drama or spectacular collapse. Its legacy is subtle, pervasive, and enduring. The boats may have slowed, the mines may have yielded less, and the temples may have transitioned from wealth to ritual symbolism, but the patterns established during the height of gold transport have continued to shape life along the Nile for generations. Gold's most enduring contribution was not material, it was structural. Labor routines, administrative practices, and ritualized behavior became deeply ingrained, persisting long after the metal itself faded. Miners, boat crews, artisans, and scribes internalized habits of precision, patience, and diligence. Children observed, learned, and carried these routines forward. The repetition of daily tasks preserved knowledge, reinforced social norms, and maintained continuity. Ritual and ceremony ensured that memory of abundance persisted. Temples, processions, and offerings reinforced the symbolic significance of gold even when the physical objects were scarce. The gestures mattered as much as the materials. Communities could look to rituals and predictable sequences to navigate uncertainty, to mark time, and to sustain cohesion. Administrative systems likewise maintained stability. Meticulous record-keeping, coordinated transport, and accountability continued to function, even under changing political circumstances. Governance relied not on spectacle, but on habituated practices and institutional memory. Gold had instilled these habits, and they endured because they were effective. Beyond the immediate communities, the influence of gold shaped trade, governance, and social expectations across broader regions. Neighboring settlements adopted similar routines and administrative practices, extending the legacy outward. Even when gold itself was absent, its lessons guided behavior, informed decision-making, and reinforced societal continuity. Cultural memory carried the quiet weight of gold. Stories of abundance, of careful management, and of ritual significance were transmitted through generations. These narratives offered guidance, reassurance, and a sense of identity. People understood that the patterns of labor, timing, and organization were as valuable as the treasure that once flowed along the river. Finally, the river itself remained the constant backdrop. It carried cargo, provided temporal rhythms, and connected communities. Its steady flow mirrored the continuity of human practice, reminding observers that life, like water, moves onward. Material wealth may shift, empires may rise and fall, but the habits, routines, and structures created to manage gold endure in subtle, enduring ways. As you imagine the final chapters of this story, picture a quiet evening along the Nile, boat crews returning from slow journeys, artisans closing workshops with practiced precision, temple rituals concluding as the sun sets, and families following routines shaped by centuries of inherited expectation. Gold may have been only a catalyst, but its legacy is woven into the very fabric of daily life, guiding human behavior, sustaining social cohesion, and preserving continuity across generations. And so, the story of Nubian gold concludes not with clamor or spectacle, but with a gentle, enduring rhythm, a legacy of quiet discipline, memory, and adaptation that continues to shape the world, softly, like the river itself. As we settle into the final stretches of this long, gentle journey, it is worth reflecting on what the story of Nubian gold truly teaches us. Not about wealth, not about conquest, and not about dramatic heroics, but about continuity, adaptation, and the quiet persistence of human systems. Gold, once abundant and tangible, has faded into symbolism, yet its influence endures in behaviors, expectations, and societal rhythms along the Nile. Think of laborers moving in harmony with the river day after day. Miners extracting or boat crews balancing cargo, artisans crafting objects with meticulous care, all performing actions that were once tied to gold, now adapted to other necessities. Their routines, internalized over generations, ensure stability even as circumstances shift. Gold was the original impetus, but the habit, the structure, and the memory became the enduring gift. Ritual and ceremony continue to anchor social life. Offerings, processions, and symbolic displays maintain a sense of order and hierarchy. Even when the physical wealth is absent, communities understand and perform these acts with fidelity. The patterns themselves carry meaning, reinforcing cohesion and continuity. Gold taught the form, society preserved it. Administration, too, demonstrates the quiet power of legacy. Record-keeping, scheduling, and oversight, once crucial for managing precious cargo, remain central to the functioning of daily life and governance. These routines outlive the material they once managed. They are testament to the principle that systems, once established and internalized, can sustain society even in the absence of the original driving force. Cultural memory plays its part. Stories, narratives, and local lore preserve lessons from the past. Children grow up hearing tales of abundance, of meticulous labor, and of ceremonial practice. These stories are not meant to excite or alarm. They simply transmit knowledge, shaping expectations and behavior. Gold may no longer glitter in their hands, but its influence shines through habit and memory. The river remains the quiet constant, mirroring and supporting the human systems it has carried for centuries. Its rhythms, flooding, receding, seasonal variation, reinforce social patterns, labor schedules, and ritual timing. The Nile is indifferent, yet its constancy provides a reliable framework that allows societies to flourish. Gold may have been ephemeral, but the structures it inspired were grounded in the enduring flow of water and the predictable passage of time. By the end of this story, we recognize that the significance of Nubian gold lies not in spectacle or material accumulation, but in the subtle shaping of human behavior. Patience, diligence, precision, and continuity, these traits, honed in response to the demands of gold transport, became embedded in daily life. They allowed communities to adapt, to preserve order, and to navigate scarcity, political upheaval, and environmental change. So, as the night winds down, imagine standing quietly on the riverbank. Boats drift slowly past, artisans close their workshops, temple bells echo softly, and families settle into predictable routines. The shimmer of gold is gone, but the patterns it established persist, guiding life quietly and reliably. This is the true legacy of Nubian gold, not in wealth or glory, but in the enduring flow of human rhythm, memory, and adaptation. As we continue, it becomes clear that the story of Nubian gold is less about treasure and more about the human capacity to sustain order, adapt, and preserve knowledge. Communities along the Nile did not merely transport a precious metal. They cultivated habits, routines, and expectations that would carry them through centuries of change. The gold itself may have vanished, but the systems it inspired endured, quietly guiding behavior and reinforcing social cohesion. One of the most profound lessons is the value of continuity. Labor routines, administrative procedures, and ritual observances all became internalized, providing a framework that survived political upheavals, environmental shifts, and economic scarcity. Miners rose at dawn, boat crews navigated currents with practiced precision, artisans honed their skills meticulously, and scribes maintained records diligently. Even when the original context, gold, was gone, these practices ensured the smooth functioning of daily life. Adaptation emerges as the second lesson. Communities learned to adjust without abandoning structure. When mines yielded less, labor shifted to other resources. When political authorities changed, administrative systems remained intact. When ritual offerings lacked material wealth, symbolism maintained their purpose. Gold had instilled standards of care, precision, and accountability that proved versatile, applicable beyond their initial context. Memory reinforced both continuity and adaptation. Stories of past abundance, meticulous craftsmanship, and ritual significance were passed quietly through generations. Children observed and absorbed the lessons of elders. Cultural memory preserved behavioral standards and expectations, ensuring that even those who had never handled gold directly were guided by practices honed over centuries. The river itself played a role in sustaining these lessons. Its predictable rhythms provided temporal structure for work, ritual, and travel. Communities synchronized activities with seasonal cycles, integrating natural patterns into societal routines. The Nile's constancy offered a stabilizing force, allowing cultural and administrative practices to persist independently of material wealth. Another subtle insight is the distinction between material and symbolic value. Gold, while tangible and precious, ultimately became a teacher rather than a goal. Its lessons, patience, precision, discipline, and procedural fidelity outlasted its physical presence. Societies learned to internalize principles once applied to gold and extend them to other aspects of life, from agriculture to trade to governance. Social cohesion was reinforced through these intertwined lessons. Hierarchies, roles, and expectations remained clear, not through displays of opulence, but through habitual performance. Laborers, artisans, and boat crews all understood their place in the system. Rituals, administration, and labor maintained balance, ensuring that daily life continued smoothly despite shifting circumstances. Even the smallest details mattered. A scribe recording a shipment, an artisan measuring a board, or a boat crew adjusting a rope all reflected practices established for managing gold. These routines became the connective tissue of society, linking generations and preserving cultural integrity. As you picture this, imagine a quiet evening along the Nile, the sun dipping toward the horizon, boats gliding silently, temples humming with ritual, families moving through familiar patterns. The material shimmer of gold is gone, yet its invisible influence remains embedded in every movement, every decision, every expectation. As our story drifts further into time, it becomes evident that the influence of Nubian gold extended well beyond its immediate era. While physical gold may have dwindled, the lessons it instilled, discipline, routine, and careful organization, continued to shape societies along the Nile and beyond. These practices became invisible currents, guiding behavior, trade, and governance long after the mines and boats had faded from prominence. Communities retained the rhythms cultivated during the age of gold transport. Miners shifted to other valuable resources, but the cadence of labor, the careful attention to technique, and the methodical management of tasks endured. Boat crews carried grain, stone, and other commodities, yet the same routines established for handling precious cargo persisted. The habits of centuries were not easily erased. Administrative systems also outlived the material wealth that had inspired them. Scribes continued meticulous record-keeping, overseers maintained schedules, and local officials enforced standards of accountability. These procedures, honed during the Golden Era, became integral to broader governance. They offered consistency and stability, ensuring that communities could function effectively despite political upheaval or fluctuating resources. Ritual and ceremonial practices remained central to social cohesion. Offerings and processions, once lavishly adorned with gold, adapted to changing circumstances. Symbolic gestures preserved meaning and reinforced hierarchy. Even when material wealth was limited, the forms and sequences established during the height of gold transport continued to structure social life. People relied on these rituals to maintain order and continuity. Trade networks similarly absorbed these lessons. Merchants and intermediaries applied practices of trust, precision, and scheduling developed for gold transport to other goods. Economic interactions became predictable and reliable, rooted in habits established generations earlier. Gold's material scarcity did not hinder commerce. Its behavioral imprint ensured that efficiency and accountability remained central. Cultural memory amplified the legacy. Tales of past abundance, careful labor, and ceremonial splendor were passed quietly through families and communities. Children internalized these lessons, learning to value discipline, attention, and routine. Societal expectations, shaped centuries earlier, persisted without the original material context, guiding behavior across time and space. Environmental cycles reinforced these practices. The Nile continued its predictable flooding and recession, providing temporal anchors for labor, transport, and ritual. Communities synchronized activities with these patterns, reinforcing the internalized rhythms established during the Golden Era. Nature itself became a stabilizing force, complementing the human systems already in place. The cumulative effect was remarkable. Societies along the Nile maintained cohesion, efficiency, and stability despite changes in leadership, trade dynamics, and resource availability. Gold had initiated these systems, but its legacy persisted in habits, memory, and expectation rather than material presence. The flow of human organization mirrored the river itself, steady, consistent, and quietly powerful. As you imagine this, picture later generations along the Nile continuing long-practiced routines, scribes counting grain with the same care once applied to gold, artisans crafting with inherited precision, boat crews moving goods in synchronized rhythm, and communities observing ritual sequences rooted in centuries of tradition. The material gold may be gone, but its influence is everywhere, embedded in time, habit, and human behavior. As we reach the final chapter of this slow, winding journey, it's time to reflect on the true significance of Nubian gold, not as treasure, but as a quiet architect of human life along the Nile. The physical metal, once dazzling and abundant, may have vanished, but the systems, behaviors, and rhythms it inspired continue to echo through generations. Its legacy is less about wealth and more about the enduring patterns it embedded into daily life. The most profound aspect of this legacy is the internalization of structure. Laborers, boat crews, artisans, and scribes all absorbed routines that were honed for the careful management of precious cargo. These routines, repeated daily over generations, became second nature. Even when the original context, gold, was no longer present, the habits persisted. Miners handled other materials with the same patience, boat crews coordinated without error, and artisans maintained meticulous standards. Gold had trained them in discipline, and discipline endured. Ritual and ceremonial practice preserved continuity. Offerings, processions, and symbolic gestures maintained meaning and hierarchy even when material wealth was scarce. Communities relied on these predictable structures to anchor social life, ensuring cohesion and shared understanding. The form mattered as much as the substance. The choreography of ritual became a vessel for cultural memory. Administrative systems remained remarkably resilient. Record-keeping, scheduling, and oversight, originally developed for gold transport, continued to underpin trade, governance,